The chief executive of Harman Industries pulled me out of a glass hallway on the 42nd floor and told me to stay away from her secretary. I'm Daniel Cross, a single father working a 6-month contract, and I assumed I'd crossed some invisible line. What I didn't understand was why the entire executive floor went silent, or why Sarah Bennett looked at me like she was holding a sentence behind her teeth. That night, Claire Harman set a folder in front of me and told me the truth. Sarah wasn't a secretary, and my friendship with her had already cracked open a secret her family had buried for years. If you enjoy stories where arrogant people finally run out of words, stay with me until the last turn. My first morning at the Harman Tower in Chicago, I understood exactly where I stood in the food chain before I even reached my desk. The lobby was polished stone and cold light, and everyone crossing it wore a suit that cost more than my monthly rent. I wore a pressed shirt and carried a leather case I'd owned for 11 years, the corners worn soft from being set down on 1,000 different tables. My phone buzzed against my hip with a reminder I'd set the night before, 3:15 pickup, and I silenced it before anyone could see the screen. I was 39, restarting a career I'd already built once and lost once, and I'd made peace with the arithmetic of that. Peace, though, is not the same thing as invisibility. The job itself was unglamorous and enormous. Harman was migrating 4 decades of corporate records, contracts, procurement files, board minutes, vendor agreements into a unified system, and somebody had to make sure nothing arrived corrupted, duplicated, or quietly missing. That somebody was me, a contract systems analyst with a badge that said so in letters small enough to be an insult. It meant I could walk through rooms most employees never entered, not because anyone trusted me, but because nobody considered me worth watching. I'd spent 9 years running my own document digitization firm before a string of failed contracts closed it, and the one thing that experience left me with was a memory for how records behave. Files leave fingerprints. People forget that. The elevators taught me the shape of the building's hierarchy fast. There were public cars, and there was one bank reserved for executives and the floors above 38, and my badge had been coded for the second because the archive floors lived up there. On my third ride, a woman stepped in behind me wearing a cream coat and the kind of composure that money buys across generations. She looked at my badge the way a person reads an expiration date, then turned to the assistant beside her and asked, without lowering her voice, why temporary staff were using the executive elevator. I said I had authorization for the archive floor. She smiled at me pleasantly and asked me to step out anyway. I stepped out. There were 6 other people in that car, and not one of them said a word. That was my introduction to Denise Colton, chair of the executive committee, and the most powerful voice on the Harman board that didn't carry the family name. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her contempt lived inside her courtesy, which made it almost impossible to answer without sounding like the unreasonable one. A skill I understood, even then, that she'd spent a lifetime refining. The doors were already closing when a hand caught them. A woman in a plain gray blouse and flat shoes held the car open and tilted her head at me, and when I hesitated, she raised her eyebrows like I was being slow. I got in. She pressed the button for 41 without asking where I was headed, and when I mentioned the archive room, she told me I wanted the north corridor, not the south, because the south had been resequenced during a renovation, and half the cabinets no longer matched their labels. She said it the way a person describes their own house. Her name was Sarah Bennett, executive secretary to the chief executive officer. Over the next 2 weeks, she quietly saved me somewhere around 40 hours of work.
She knew which storage rooms had been consolidated and in what year. She knew the 1998 vendor files had been split across 2 floors after a flood, and that the paper originals of anything before 1986 sat in a facility in Aurora nobody had inventoried since the last CFO retired. Once, when I couldn't find a set of procurement binders, she thought for a moment and told me to check behind the fire panel in the eastern stairwell, and there they were, exactly there, coated in 11 years of dust. I laughed and asked whether she was a secretary or the person who'd built the building. She didn't laugh back right away. She looked at the row of cabinets a second longer than the joke deserved, and told me that in certain places, if you want to survive, you learn every exit. Then she smiled and asked whether I wanted coffee, and the moment folded shut like it had never opened. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon, and I couldn't make it fit the woman who scheduled lunches and printed briefing packets. There were other small wrong notes, too. She kept her voice careful in meetings, and when the finance people started talking about tranches and voting thresholds, she'd look politely lost, but her eyes moved with the numbers half a second ahead of the explanation. She looked at certain board members the way you look at people whose bad habits you've known for years. And on her right hand she wore a plain old ring, the gold worn thin, a small symbol cut into the face, a letter H inside a wreath of laurel. I noticed it because I'd seen that same mark that morning, carved into the frame of the portrait of Walter Harmon that hung outside the boardroom, the founder, dead 4 years, staring down at everyone who passed with the calm of a man who'd already won. I didn't ask about the ring. I told myself it was a coincidence, a company gift, 100 other things. But I'd spent my working life noticing when 2 documents that shouldn't match do, and something in me filed it away and refused to let it go. By the end of my 3rd week, I had a routine. In at 7:43, floors of cabinet work, lunch at my desk, out the door at 5:03 so I could be at the school gate by 5:40. My daughter Emma was 10 and had opinions about everything, including my tie collection, which she described as a series of unfortunate decisions. Leaving on time made me a strange animal in that building. Twice I heard a director refer to me as the one who runs off, and once, passing the executive break area, I heard Denise Colton tell someone that Harmon used to hire men
who built companies and now apparently hired men who left meetings early for school pickup. I kept walking. I'd learned over a long and expensive year that the only response those remarks deserve is the sound of you still doing your job. But I also started paying closer attention to the woman who'd said it, and to the enormous, orderly, humming machine of records that she and everyone above me assumed I was too small to actually read. Sarah and I fell into a rhythm without ever deciding to. She handled Claire Harmon's calendar and a portion of the executive document flow, which meant we crossed paths 4 or 5 times a day in corridors and record rooms, once in the freight elevator with a cart full of bankers' boxes. We talked about nothing important. She liked that I never performed for anyone with a title. I liked that she never once used the phrase "you people" and treated my contract like a temporary condition of my character. She asked about Emma, remembered the answers, and asked follow-up questions a week later that proved she'd actually listened. It was not romance, I want that understood, because everyone who heard about it later assumed otherwise, and that assumption is what nearly destroyed me. It was the ordinary decency of 2 adults who found each other tolerable in a building where tolerance was rationed. She brought me coffee once when I was elbow-deep in a cabinet of 1991 shipping manifests. I brought her a bagel the day the board ran a 9-hour session, and she was still at her desk when I left at 5:03, and still there when I called back at 7 to ask about a file code. The afternoon that changed everything, she came around a corner with an armful of folders and a phone pinned under her chin and clipped the edge of a cart I was pushing. Paper went everywhere. We both dropped to gather it, apologizing over each other, and I picked up a page that didn't belong with the rest. Old, heavier stock, the ink slightly feathered the way real ink feathers over decades. Near the bottom, I saw a signature I recognized from the wall outside the boardroom. Walter Harmon, in a tight, forward-leaning hand. Sarah took it out of my fingers, not roughly, but fast, faster than a person takes back a lunch order, slid it into the middle of the stack, stood, thanked me, and was gone before I'd straightened my back. I stood in that corridor with my hands full of ordinary paperwork and a very quiet alarm going off somewhere behind my ribs. Whatever that page was, it hadn't come from a CEO's calendar. It had come from somewhere else entirely, and she hadn't wanted me to read it. Above us, running the length of the 42nd floor, there's a glass corridor connecting the executive suite to the boardroom. Anyone standing in it can see down into the mezzanine where Sarah and I had been kneeling on the carpet. When I looked up, Claire Harmon was standing there with a tablet in her hand, perfectly still. I'd seen her 3 times in a month, always from a distance, always in motion, people arranging themselves around her like iron filings. She was 42, precise in a way that made precision look like a personality trait, and I'd never once seen her expression change. It changed then. Not anger exactly, the look of someone watching a small stone come loose from a wall.
An hour later, my desk phone rang, and a voice I didn't recognize told me the chief executive would see me now. Her office was on the corner, and she didn't offer me a chair. She stood behind her desk, fingertips resting on the surface, and asked without preamble how close I was to Sarah Bennett. I said we worked in overlapping areas and that she'd helped me locate archive material. Claire asked whether that was all. I said yes. Then, because the question had an edge on it I didn't like, I asked whether there was a policy at Harmon prohibiting 2 employees from speaking to each other. She looked at me a long moment. Then she said evenly that whatever friendship I thought I was building with her secretary, I needed to end it. I felt the heat come up the back of my neck. I told her I'd been in the building 22 days and hadn't once been late, missed a deliverable, or accessed a file outside my assignment, and that if she wanted to terminate a contractor, she didn't need a reason, so she could simply say so. She didn't blink. She said this wasn't a company rule. Then what is it? I asked. A warning, she said. She didn't explain. She looked back down at her tablet, and the meeting was over, and I walked out through a reception area where 2 assistants suddenly found their monitors extremely interesting. In the elevator, I ran the conversation again and landed on the only conclusion the evidence supported, the wrong one. I decided Claire Harmon was either a woman who considered her staff property or a woman with a personal entanglement she didn't want observed. Both explanations made her small. Neither was true, and I'd spend the next 4 weeks being punished for the confidence with which I believed them. I didn't sleep well that night. Emma had a science project involving a volcano, baking soda, and a level of optimism I did not possess. After she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a folder of my own, the boring one, the mortgage and the health plan, and the number of months my contract had left. 5. 5 months of stability after 14 months without it. I remember thinking that a man in my position doesn't get to be proud about being spoken to badly. I remember deciding to keep my head down. The next morning, I left my phone in the archive room on 41. I noticed at the elevator bank, went back, and stopped in the doorway because the lights on that side of the floor were off, and someone was standing at the desk Sarah used when she worked down there. Denise Colton. She had a drawer open and a folder in her hand, reading it with the unhurried attention of a woman who's never once in her life been asked what she's doing. I must have made a sound. She turned, and I did the only thing I could think of, walked toward the shelving like I'd come in for a file, pulled out a binder at random, and said, "Good evening." She watched me do it.
She closed the drawer with no particular haste, tucked the folder under her arm, and told me, in that warm and terrible voice, that I was beginning to turn up in places that weren't meant for me. Then she wished me a pleasant night and left, and I stood there holding a binder of 1989 freight schedules with my heart going like a hammer.
The retaliation started 4 days later in a room full of people. We had a project status meeting every other Tuesday, about 20 directors and department heads around a table of dark wood, and my part was 6 minutes on migration progress. I'd prepared a slide of exceptions, the ordinary garbage any data migration produces: mismatched fields, duplicate identifiers, orphaned attachments. Buried in that list was one item I'd flagged because it was genuinely strange rather than merely messy. A cluster of vendor contracts carried execution dates from 6 years earlier, but the underlying file objects hadn't existed in any Harman system until 3 years ago. I presented it as what I believed it was, a technical problem requiring verification. Bradley Stone, the general counsel, didn't let me finish the sentence. He was 47, expensively assembled, and he spoke to me the way people speak to a waiter who's interrupted a story. "We hired you to move data," he said, "not to interpret it." I said flagging inconsistencies was literally the definition of the audit portion of my contract. Denise smiled down the table and observed that a technician should understand the difference between access and authority. I was told, in front of 19 people, to hold my remaining observations for my supervisor. I sat down. I want to be honest about that moment because I've replayed it many times. I wasn't brave. I was calculating the number of school fees between me and unemployment, and the calculation told me to be quiet. So I was quiet, and I watched the meeting move on, and I noticed Bradley Stone write something down immediately after I stopped talking, which is not what people do when a subject is unimportant. Sarah found me in the corridor afterward. She asked what I'd actually seen, and something in her voice had lost its softness. I explained the metadata problem in plain terms. When a document is created inside a system, the system stamps it. You can change what a page says. Changing what the system remembers about when the page arrived is a different problem, and most people who alter records never think about it because the visible page is the only thing they've ever had to worry about. I told her 3 contracts showed a 6-year gap between their claimed signing and their earliest system trace. She asked for the vendor names. I gave them: Atlas Freightways, Sterling Logistics Group, Denton Terminal Services. She repeated them under her breath, and she didn't look surprised. She looked like a person confirming a suspicion she'd been carrying a long time. When I asked why a secretary would care about supplier contracts, she said she'd typed enough board minutes to be curious, the first time she ever lied to me, and we both knew it. 2 days later, I got an email from an address in the compliance office regarding unauthorized access to materials outside my assigned scope. Attached was a list of 9 file paths. I read it 3 times. Every single one of those 9 files had been assigned to me by the migration system itself, automatically, as part of my queue. I hadn't gone looking for anything. The queue had handed them to me, which meant whoever wrote that email either didn't understand how the tool worked or understood it perfectly and expected nobody else did. That was the moment the temperature in my life changed. This wasn't contempt anymore. Somebody was building a file on me, and a file isn't built for entertainment. It's built to be produced later, in a room, in front of people who will be asked to make a decision.
I forwarded the email to my own records, printed a copy, and drove home in traffic I don't remember. That night, after Emma went to bed, my phone rang with a number from the staffing agency holding my contract. The woman on the line was apologetic in the way people are when they've been told to be. She said the client had raised questions about scope compliance and that my engagement might be subject to review. I asked what that meant. She said she didn't know yet. I said thank you and hung up and sat at the kitchen table with the mortgage statement and my daughter's field trip permission slips side by side.
For about 20 minutes, I seriously considered calling the agency back and asking to be reassigned anywhere that wasn't the 42nd floor of a tower where powerful people had decided I was inconvenient. I didn't call. I've thought about why. I think it's because I'd already lost a business and swallowed the loss and told myself it was market conditions, and some part of me could not survive swallowing a second thing that wasn't my fault. The next morning, I found Sarah in the North Corridor and told her about the agency call. Her face didn't move much, but her hand tightened on the folder she was holding. She told me I should listen to Claire. I said I'd happily listen to Claire if anyone in that building would tell me what I was supposed to be avoiding. She looked past me at the row of cabinets for a moment. Not what, she said. Who? Then she walked away, and I stood in a hallway full of 40 years of paper, understanding for the first time that I hadn't stumbled into a personality conflict. I'd stumbled into the edge of something with a shape, and the shape had already noticed me. I decided to do what I'd been told. For 6 days, I avoided Sarah Bennett completely. I took the freight elevator, ate lunch in my car, routed every question about archive structure through a supervisor who answered half of them wrong. It felt cowardly, and it felt sensible, and those two feelings don't cancel each other out. It also didn't matter, because by then the decision had already been made somewhere above me, and my compliance was irrelevant to it. On a Thursday at 11 in the morning, Bradley Stone came down to the migration floor with 2 people from corporate security. He informed me in a voice pitched to Carrie that my system access was suspended pending an investigation into the unauthorized duplication of confidential material. Nobody touched me, nobody grabbed my arm or marched me anywhere. It was worse than that, because it was polite. A young man from security asked for my badge, held a scanner against it, and deactivated it in the middle of the lobby while 11 people watched and pretended not to. Denise Colton happened to be crossing that lobby. She stopped near a column, close enough that her voice reached me without effort, and remarked to her companion that this was precisely why the company shouldn't extend trust to people who are desperate for a paycheck. I felt something go white behind my eyes. I have a temper. I inherited it. I've worked on it for 2 decades, and I've learned the only thing rage buys a man in my position is a story other people get to tell about him afterward. So I turned to Bradley and asked, calmly, to see the evidence. He said the matter was under review. I asked which files, on what dates, from which terminal. He said the matter was under review. I asked whether I was being accused of theft, because if I was, I'd like that stated clearly in writing with a name attached to it. He smiled and told me someone would be in touch with my agency. Then he walked away, and I picked up my case and started toward the doors, with a decade of professional reputation coming apart quietly behind my ribs. My phone buzzed in the revolving door. Unknown number. 4 words. Garage level 3. Don't leave. I stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a full minute deciding. Then I went back in through the parking entrance and down 2 ramps, and at the far end of level 3 there was a service corridor and a small conference room I'd never seen on any floor plan. No glass, no nameplate, and a door that Claire Harmon locked behind me. Sarah was already sitting at the table. Claire didn't apologize and didn't ease into it. She set 4 things down in front of me, one at a time, like a person dealing cards. A birth certificate from Cook County, 32 years old, mother's name filled in, father's line completed in a later different hand. A trust instrument, 16 pages, establishing a holding of voting stock to be released upon a named condition. A photograph of Walter Harmon standing beside a woman I'd never seen, both of them squinting into sunlight somewhere with water behind them. And a laboratory report, 4 years old, confirming a first-degree biological relationship between 2 coded samples. Her name isn't Sarah Bennett, Sarah said. I looked at Sarah. She met my eyes and didn't look away, and there was something in her expression I recognized because I'd seen it in my own mirror during the year my business died. The exhaustion of a person who's been carrying a fact alone for a very long time. "She's Sarah Harmon," Claire said. "My sister." The room did a slow, quiet tilt. Walter Harmon had a daughter outside his marriage. He never publicly acknowledged her, and by every account he wasn't a warm man about it, but in the last 2 years of his life he did 3 things. He met her. He confirmed the relationship privately with a test no one else knew existed, and he instructed an independent attorney in Springfield, outside the company's own legal department, to draft a trust placing a block of voting stock in Sarah's name, releasable when and if she took a formal seat on the Harmon board. I asked how large a block. Claire told me. I sat down without being invited. It wasn't a majority. It didn't have to be. Harmon's control rested for 9 years on a coalition, and the arithmetic of that coalition worked only because Denise Colton could reliably deliver the votes attached to 2 allied family blocks and her own committee chairmanship. Sarah's stock, once activated, didn't make her queen of anything. It made Denise's coalition a minority by a little over 3%. And 3% in a room like that is the difference between a woman who decides who belongs and a woman who's asked to explain herself. Claire had known about her sister for 4 years. She'd also known that the moment Sarah appeared as an heir, every instrument connected to her would be attacked, delayed, litigated, buried, and that Sarah would be walking into a fight with a company she'd never
Worked inside a day of her life. So Claire had done something brilliant or grotesque, depending on which chair you sat in. She'd hired her sister as her own executive secretary under her mother's surname and let her spend 21 months learning the building from the inside, watching how the money actually moved before anyone knew what she was. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the corner office. So why warn me away from her? Claire folded her hands. "Because Denise doesn't know what Sarah knows," she said, "but she now believes that you do." I turned it over. Denise had seen us in the corridor together. Denise had found me standing in an archive room at night, in a doorway she hadn't expected anyone to occupy. Denise had heard me stand up in a meeting and describe out loud, in front of 19 directors, a timing discrepancy in 3 vendor contracts. From where she sat, I wasn't a contractor who'd noticed a data error. I was Sarah's friend, and Sarah's friend had started reading exactly the records that would matter most. There was one more layer, which Claire gave me last because she was still deciding in real time how much to hand a man she barely knew. Sarah hadn't come to Harmon only to claim her stock. She'd come because in the 18 months after their father's death, while the estate was unsettled and the company operated under interim authority, a significant volume of internal documentation had been amended: voting agreements, supplier terms, committee charters. Nobody had been killed, nobody had been threatened. This wasn't that kind of story. It was the other kind, the kind where a chairwoman with excellent lawyers uses the disorder following a funeral to move a comma here and a signature block there until the structure that results looks exactly like the one that always existed. Sarah spoke for the first time. "Daniel," she said. She'd been looking for 2 years for a single document she couldn't explain away, and she'd never found one, because every alteration had been made by people who understood law and understood paper. Then she looked at me. "What I couldn't find," she said, "was somebody who understood systems." And I sat in a windowless room under a parking garage with my badge deactivated, my contract under review, my daughter's school fees due on the 9th, and finally understood the shape of the thing that had noticed me. I didn't thank them for the explanation. I was angry, and I said so, which isn't a thing I usually do in rooms containing chief executives. I told them they'd spent 2 years running a private operation inside a public company, and that when they needed a place to put the risk, it had landed on the one person in the building, without a family office, without a retainer attorney, without a single unit of equity in anything. I told them I had a 10-year-old at home who thought her father had finally found a steady job. I asked whether either of them had considered even once what happens to men like me when people like them start moving pieces. Claire didn't defend herself. That surprised me more than anything else she'd done.
She said that if I wanted to walk out of the building that evening, she'd personally ensure my contract was paid in full through its term, and that the access suspension would be recorded as administrative rather than disciplinary, so nothing would follow me into my next job. She said it without conditions and without a pause for me to consider what I owed her. It was the first moment I understood that the cold woman who'd ordered me to end a friendship might not be the person I'd decided she was. I stood up to leave. I had my hand on my case. Then, because I've never in my life been able to walk away from an unresolved inconsistency, I asked one question. The evidence Bradley has, the download log, when was the record created? Sarah slid a printout across the table. She'd pulled it that morning before anyone knew to stop her, because a secretary who spent 21 months learning a building knows which reports run at 6 a.m. and who forgets to check who requested them. I sat back down and read it again, and put my finger on a string of 11 characters at the end of the object identifier and asked them both whether they knew what that prefix meant. They didn't, because there's no reason on earth a chief executive would. It's a housekeeping detail. When Harmon migrated to the new environment, every record imported from a legacy source was stamped with a source identifier so we could trace lineage, resolve duplicates, and prove chain of custody during the transition. Records created natively in the new system carry one prefix. Records lifted from the old archive platform carry another. The prefix on the file I'd supposedly downloaded from my workstation belonged to the old archive platform. That platform was decommissioned 3 years ago. It hasn't accepted a new write operation since the week it was shut down, which meant the log entry showing Daniel Cross copying a confidential file wasn't a record of something I'd done. It was an old record of someone else had done years earlier, pulled out of a legacy store, edited so the user field read my name, and reinserted into the evidence chain by a person who had no idea the system stamps its own memory. Nobody spoke for a moment. Claire asked the only question that mattered next. Who still has write access to the legacy store? 3 accounts, I told her, and I knew because I'd spent my second week documenting exactly that in a report nobody had read. The chief executive's own administrative credential, which is why the answer had to be given carefully in front of her, the director of information technology, and a standing credential belonging to the Office of General Counsel, retained during the migration so legal holds could be applied to archived material. Bradley Stone's office. Sarah made a small sound, not quite a laugh. I should say clearly that I didn't break into anything. I didn't write code, crack a password, or perform theatrical nonsense people imagine when they hear the word audit. I asked for permission, and Claire granted it in writing, on her own authority, to examine the offline backup set held at the Aurora facility. It took 2 days. I worked in a room with concrete walls and a coffee machine from another decade, and Sarah sat across from me with a legal pad while I taught her to read lineage stamps the way you'd teach anyone to read a bus schedule.
We found the 3 vendor contracts first: Atlas, Sterling, Denton. In the offline backup taken 11 months before the migration, those contracts didn't exist at all. Not in draft, not in a different folder, not under a different name. They appeared for the first time in a supplemental import performed during the estate period following Walter Harmon's death, then were assigned execution dates 6 years prior to their own creation. Then we followed the money, which is the part nobody ever hides properly because payments have to actually clear. Across 26 months, those 3 entities had received a combined total of a little over $41 million in freight consolidation and terminal handling fees. All 3 were incorporated in the same 8-week window. All 3 used the same registered agent. All 3 had received their initial capitalization through an intermediary partnership whose limited partners included a fund managed by Colton Capital Holdings.
It wasn't a confession. I want to be precise about that because I was precise about it at the time. Nothing we found proved Denise Colton had personally ordered anything. What we had was a set of contracts that couldn't have been signed when they claimed, paid to companies that hadn't existed when the work was supposedly agreed, tracing back through 2 layers to an entity in which the chair of the executive committee held a beneficial interest that had never been disclosed to the board. That's not enough to convict anyone. It's more than enough to compel an independent audit, and an independent audit is the one thing in the corporate world that cannot be charmed, outranked, or asked to step out of an elevator. I remember Claire reading the summary I'd assembled twice all the way through without a single question, which told me she was better with documents than she'd ever let anyone see. Then she set it down and said we'd need 3 weeks to prepare the presentation properly with outside counsel, so nothing could be dismissed as internal politics. We didn't get 3 weeks, we got 9 days. Denise Colton didn't know what we had, but she knew something was being assembled because women who survive 40 decades in rooms like that develop an instinct for the sound of preparation. On a Monday morning, she invoked a provision of the committee charter and called an emergency session of the board, framing it as a governance matter concerning the conduct of the chief executive officer. Her case was clean, and that's what made it dangerous. Claire Harmon had employed a close family member without disclosure. That family member had been engaged under a surname that wasn't the one on her trust instruments. Together, they'd granted an outside contractor under active investigation for data theft access to sensitive archival material. Every one of those statements was, in isolation, true. Assembled in order, they described a chief executive running a private scheme inside a public company. And if the board suspended Claire before Sarah could take a seat, the stock would stay locked, the coalition would hold, and the audit would die in a subcommittee Denise chaired. They summoned me into the boardroom as an interested party, which is the corporate term for a man who's present so he can be pointed at. I stood near the end of a table 26 feet long when Bradley Stone displayed the access log on the wall screen, and I watched 14 directors look at my name in a column and quietly decide who I was. Denise didn't shout. She looked at me almost kindly and told me not to confuse being permitted to sit at this table with belonging at it. When I began explaining that the log entry had been fabricated, Bradley laughed and asked whether I was seriously suggesting the legal
Department of a multi-billion-dollar corporation understood its own systems less well than a 6-month contractor. No, I said, I'm suggesting whoever altered it was counting on everyone in this room to think exactly the way you just did. That bought me 11 seconds of silence, and then Denise spent them. She said that since the board's time was being consumed by claims about heirs and trusts, perhaps they should address the underlying fiction directly. She put a document on the screen, a deed of renunciation dated 8 years earlier, bearing Walter Harmon's signature, in which he disclaimed any intent to convey stockholding interests to the individual named in a certain private trust, and directed that any such instrument be treated as void if authentic. Sarah had nothing. No stock, no seat, no leverage, and Claire had risked a company for a woman with no claim at all. I looked at Claire. She'd gone perfectly still. Sarah beside her had the face of someone who's just been handed a photograph of a room she's never entered. I understood that neither of them had ever seen this page before in their lives. The vote to suspend was proposed and seconded. I stood there looking at the screen, at a scanned page 8 years old, at a small mark in the bottom right corner of the footer. I asked them to enlarge it. Nobody moved, so I said it again, louder, and Claire told the technician to do it. The logo swelled across the wall. The letter H inside the laurel wreath, but a particular version of it. The wreath opened at the top, the serifs squared off. I asked the room whether anyone present remembered when that mark had come into use. 2 of the directors did because they'd voted on it. Harman Industries had adopted that visual identity in a rebranding program approved 6 years ago. The document on the screen was dated 8 years ago. The mark on its footer hadn't existed for another 24 months after the day it was supposedly signed. Bradley said immediately, smoothly, that it was obviously a recent scan of an older original, and that scanning software applies letterhead templates all the time. I'd expected that, because it's the only answer available, so I asked him to produce the archive watermark. Every document ingested into the old storage platform received a machine-applied identifier at ingestion, a string in the lower margin that couldn't be removed without destroying the file signature. Any genuine paper from 8 years ago that had ever lived in the Harman archive would carry it. That page carried nothing. It had never been in the archive at all. Then I gave them the last piece, because a room like that requires you to stop being clever and start being boring. The scan header embedded in the file identified the device that produced it, a specific model of production scanner. I asked the chief financial officer to open the procurement records live on his own terminal and read the purchase date of the first such unit acquired by Harman Industries. He read it out, 3 years ago, in March. "Don't trust me," I said. "Trust your own purchasing files."
Denise Colton lost her composure for the first time in my presence, and it wasn't dramatic. It was a 2-second delay before an answer, which in her case was an earthquake. She asked the board how it had come to weigh the word of a temporary employee against the officers of the company. And for once, the sentence didn't land, because nobody in that room was looking at me anymore. They were looking at the wall, where a forged page sat enlarged in front of 14 people who'd almost voted on it. Sarah stood up. She'd brought the original trust instrument, the one their father had lodged with independent counsel in Springfield, along with the attorney's certification and a signature verification Harman's own legal department had produced 2 years earlier in an unrelated tax proceeding. Bradley couldn't challenge the signature because his office had already authenticated it in a filing bearing his name. She stated her claim on the record. The stock released. The arithmetic in that room rearranged itself in the space of a single sentence, and the motion to suspend Claire Harman died without ever reaching a vote. Instead, the board voted 13-1 to commission an independent forensic audit of the executive committee's vendor relationships and the document alterations performed during the estate period. Afterward, I didn't celebrate. I went down to 41 and started packing the personal things I kept in a drawer, because habits from a year of unemployment don't leave you quickly. Claire found me there, in the same room where I'd once stood holding a binder of freight schedules with my heart pounding. "You should have told me sooner," I said. She agreed. Then she told me the last true thing, the piece she'd never intended to say out loud. 3 years earlier, another auditor had begun asking questions about the Colton supplier contracts. He wasn't harmed. Nobody in this story was ever harmed that way. He was simply removed from his engagement, sued for breach of a confidentiality agreement, tied up for 19 months in a proceeding he couldn't afford, and made quietly unemployable in an industry with a very small number of employers. Claire had watched it happen. So when she looked down from a glass corridor and saw Denise Colton's attention settle on a contractor kneeling on a carpet next to her sister, she did the only thing she believed would work quickly. She was cold enough that I would obey her. I wasn't warning you away from Sarah because I doubted you. I was warning you because I know precisely what people like Denise do to men who don't have our money. I told her that next time she might consider telling the truth before issuing the order. She laughed once, briefly, and it changed her whole face. The independent audit ran 14 weeks. It found undisclosed conflicts in 6 supplier agreements,
unauthorized amendments to 4 internal governance records, fabricated evidence supporting a disciplinary matter against a contract employee, and, most damaging of all, that credentials belonging to the Office of the General Counsel had been used to write to a decommissioned archive on 11 separate occasions. Nobody was arrested. That's not how these things go, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling it.
Something. Denise Colton stepped away from all committee positions pending resolution. Bradley Stone was suspended and then quietly separated. Outside counsel took custody of the records. I saw Denise once more in the lobby near the same column. She still carried herself like a woman who'd never been asked to leave anything. She asked me whether I imagined that one meeting had changed my position. No, I said. She waited. It changed yours. The elevator doors closed on her, and I want to be honest, it was the most satisfying 11 seconds of my professional life, and it made no sound at all. 6 weeks later, Sarah returned to the company under her own name and declined an executive seat. She took a position on the Oversight and Ethics Committee instead, because she didn't want authority handed to her by a surname, and I have never respected a decision more. Claire offered me something permanent, Director of Records Integrity and Systems Compliance, with a salary that made me read the page twice. I asked whether the title came with executive elevator privileges. "Only if you stop talking to my secretary," she said. I looked past her. The desk outside her office was empty, and Sarah was standing near the window with a new nameplate in her hand that read, "Sarah Harmon, Board Oversight." "You don't have a secretary anymore," I said. "Exactly," Claire answered. On my first day in the new role, I left the building at 5:03 because that has never been negotiable. A newly promoted director tried to hold me for a briefing, and Claire looked at the clock on the wall and told him Mr. Cross had somewhere more important to be. I rode down to the ground floor with a case I'd owned for 11 years and drove across the city to a school gate where a 10-year-old with strong opinions on neckties was waiting for me. There was no limousine. I didn't become wealthy. Nobody handed me a company. I got back the 3 things I'd lost, which were steady work, a clean name, and a place where what I actually knew was finally worth something. Behind me, 42 floors of glass and dark wood were being rebuilt from the inside by a room full of people who'd been so certain of what a man is worth that they never once considered reading the records he was hired to carry.